All right, it's a stroke of 11. We'll go ahead and get started. I should warn everyone in advance. I'm a bit of a rambler. I will go on way past the 45 minutes, so I want to try to cover what we can and have some time for Q&A at the end of this as well. But we'll get started now so we can get as much in as we can. My name is Nathan Wenzler. I'm the Chief Security Strategist at Tenable. For those of you who may not be familiar with Tenable, we are a vulnerability management software company, the creators of Nessus. If you've been working in information security for any length of time, it is likely you have seen or heard of or used Nessus at some point. I've been working in the information security field for nearly 25 years now. I'm sneaking up on that. And I think Nessus was one of the very first things I got into using, building out security programs and whatnot. So kind of nice for me to come full circle for my career. I'm working for the company that kind of started with some of the tools that I used early on. And what I want to talk about today, Tenable's been doing this about 20-ish years, 21 years or so. And I have been very fortunate in a lot of ways to have worked in both private and public sector. I've helped build programs, I've consulted, I've done a lot of really crazy things, which we won't talk about openly because some of it's still under NDA. Those three-letter agencies. Anyway, the vulnerability management's changed a lot in the last 20 years. And Tenable's changing with that, but what I'm out here to talk about today is sort of what I've seen as the challenges that a lot of companies are having around vulnerability management as a concept, and how that industry is changing. Because it is changing right now. We're finally kind of doing what I like to refer to as VM 2.0. My marketers hate that. They want me to keep saying risk-based vulnerability management. You'll hear that a lot from me today. But we have to stop the way we've done it before, and so let's talk a little bit about that. Please also feel free anytime in the middle of this to jump up and ask questions. I'm happy to throw out any kind of discussion here in the middle of this as we go. So I'll talk a little bit about where some of the problems are, where I see that we have challenges around why we're doing things the same old way. Talk a little bit about what VM 2.0 in my mind really means. Because it changes the way we look at vulnerabilities, it changes the way we remediate. It also changes the way that we talk to all the business partners we have in an organization about what these things mean. And we'll use a little bit of Tenable's own methodology for it, because it actually has a very nice data model that I want to show that you could probably leverage a similar sort of thing in your organization if you wished, but just to give you an idea of what it kind of looks like. And then we'll talk a little bit more about sort of what the questions we're answering. When you start taking a risk-based approach to dealing with vulnerabilities, you stop asking questions like, are we scanning a lot? And you start asking questions about, where are we really exposed? It changes the nature of what we're trying to do. So we'll go over that a little bit. There's a lot of different areas that when you take this risk-based approach, it really does change how you manage your security program in a lot of ways. So with that, how many of you here remember these? Okay, good. Boy, I was going to get scared there for a minute if nobody did. So, I played all of these till my fingers were falling off. But for any of you who had Nintendo, the NES, the original one, you had these. Do you remember when you would put the cartridge in and you set it down, you turn it on, and sometimes the screen would be all screwy? And what do we do when that would happen? We'd pull the cartridge out, we'd turn it sideways, we'd blow into the cartridge, right? And then we'd shove it back in there really hard, because that obviously is going to work, force, slam that lid down and turn it on. And you know what, lo and behold, it would work. Well, half the time. And, as a kid, I didn't think anything of it. It just seemed like the logical thing to do. As I got older and you start to realize how these things work, it did literally nothing. Literally. There have been tests now since then. I've seen Mythbusters type folks have actually done tests on this with the connection points in the cartridges and how the NES does the touch points and all of it. That blowing on it did nothing, literally nothing. And yet, we still did it every time, still expected that result to happen. And at least it sort of seemed like it worked, right? I have told this story to people and they look at me and they say, yeah, but it did work. I know it did. It doesn't matter whether we know for a fact that it doesn't. We're very much stuck in as creatures of habit. We want to believe the things we know. Part of that is because of something many authors have talked about called the curse of knowledge. Now, if you're not familiar with this term, I really encourage you to do some research on this. As a security practitioner, we are a very specialized group of people. We are very akin to people like doctors and lawyers. We have a set of knowledge that is different than a lot of other folks, and it's a very, very technical and deep discipline that we do. When you work in that kind of field, you suffer from this idea of the curse of knowledge. And essentially what it means is, when you know a lot about something, you tend to see the world through those glasses. Everything becomes that. If you're a doctor, every problem is a medical problem. If you're a lawyer, every problem is a legal problem. If you're a security practitioner, we sometimes get stuck in that, right? Every problem is a hacker breaking into our environment. Well, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's your employee. Sometimes it's your boss. Sometimes it's bad policy. Sometimes it's nothing to do with security at all. But we get caught up in this thing. This is what we do as humans. Being aware of this kind of thing, I should also mention one more thing. Those of you who are familiar with Malcolm Gladwell, the author, he does a great bit on this as well in one of his books, and you should definitely read that too. It's eye-opening in a lot of ways, as someone who is also personally guilty of this very thing. It's a really important bit of awareness about how we function that really helped me a lot in my own career. Right? Changed how I approached policy management, changed how I approached advising my customers, all kinds of things. So check this notion out. It's an important one.
Which book?
I want to say it's, is it Outliers? It was either Outliers or David and Goliath. Don't hold me to that one though. I'll have to go back and look. I read them all, like at one point I got hooked, and then it all blurred together. It's like one big book. So. But he calls it the burden of knowledge. If you want to look that up, it'll be easier to find. Okay, so we kind of get stuck doing the old thing. It's comfortable, we know it, we've been doing it for a long time, it works. We tell ourselves it works. We really believe it works, right? Because just like blowing in the cartridge, sure, it worked. So 20 years ago, this is the model that a lot of folks were using to try to implement vulnerability management. 2 days ago, people are still trying to use this model to implement vulnerability management. The notion's pretty simple, right? Get some kind of scanning device up and running on the network, let it scan, find devices, come back with a mountain of data, put that data into a report, and then send it off to your admins and tell them, hey guys, fix all this stuff, and then you go home for the weekend, you take a nap. Ooh. Well, the projector just took a nap. Thank you. There we go. All right. So, I mean, look, I've been guilty of this exact thing. The very first vulnerability management program I ever built was for a government agency. We did this exact problem. I was so proud of myself. I put together this PDF report for my one of my server admins. And I noticed month after month he wasn't getting anything fixed. The data just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I asked him, I said, hey, are you getting my reports? Yeah, I get your reports. Great, how come you're not patching? And he goes, well, you expect I read your report? It's a 12,000 page PDF. He wasn't wrong, it was a 12,000 page PDF. I thought I was being complete, right? This is how we do it. Let's get lots of data, give him everything he can possibly need, and he'll just go magically fix everything. It didn't happen. People are still doing this today. I have consulted for organizations and walked in and I've asked them, how do you do remediation? Oh, I sent a 12,000 page PDF to my admins. You are not doing anyone any favors, all right? When you take this kind of approach to vulnerability management, you're really not, you're not doing vulnerability management at all. Oh, now everything's breaking. Apologize. You're really kind of doing a form of assessment. So scanning's still important, right? If there's anything I'm going to tell you today, not just because I'm a Tenable employee and we do a scanner, it's still really important. Network-based assessment is a thing. But do not think that assessment is all you have to do. Because all that data you're gathering is useless unless you put some context around it, unless you really know what you're going to do with it from a business standpoint and from an operational standpoint. Handing admins 20,000 page or 12,000 page PDFs, don't ever do that. If there's anything I can impart to anyone who's starting their career, just don't do it. So, we have this old way of doing things. We're kind of caught up in what we think we know is right. And then we have all these different audiences that we have to talk to on a regular basis. If there's something about security as a concept, or information security as a concept that I can impart, any of you who might be new or learning in this thing, I want you to understand this and take this away if nothing else. If you're working up in one of those first two fields at some point in your career, you are not in IT. You are not a technologist. You are in risk management. Security as a function, we have to be very sharp technically. We do have to understand how all this technology works and interlinks together. But at the end of the day, we as security practitioners are risk managers. We are here to help advise where a company's most exposed, how we can help protect them. That doesn't always mean patching. That means maybe we need to change how we do business. Maybe we need to buy insurance. Maybe we need to just hope and pray. Well, don't do that last one. But, you know, avoidance is a strategy for dealing with risk. Not a great one, but here we are. So if we know that security practitioners are really risk managers, it's not just IT people we're talking to. We have to talk to them, but you're also going to be talking to folks like the CFO. Some of my biggest champions I've had in organizations to make security programs work have been the CFOs. Because when I can sit down with that CFO and say, you and I are in the same business. You're concerned about the fiscal well-being of this company. I'm concerned about the fiscal well-being of this company. I'm not the network guy. I'm not the DBA. I'm here to help you manage risk. You're here to help us manage risk. Let's work together. It's amazing how that conversation changes once they realize that you're not just some tech head wearing a hoodie, eating Cheetos, hacking things in the background like in the Matrix. Which, by the way, a lot of them still think that's what we do. So you have a lot of different audience members you're talking to from a risk perspective, from a security perspective, and they all have different needs. They all have different problems. We cannot keep looking at this the same way, right? And that's where, as we talk about this risk-based approach to dealing with vulnerabilities, we have to be able to help these people, all of them. And risk-based approach is kind of the starting thing. It's what I'm seeing in the industry. The last several years, we've all been trying to move to this a little bit. We're finally starting to see it formalized. We're starting to see frameworks come out around this, specifically in the VM space. And it starts to be able to help address some of these issues that these people are having in the organization. Make sense, everybody, so far? Okay. So, if you're going to do risk-based vulnerability management, you have to approach it from the standpoint that it's not just about scanning. VM as a concept is really a big, big workflow. It's about remediation. It's about patch management. It's about application security. Are you looking at your ingress points from applications? It's honestly a lot about reporting. It's how do you present this information to the people so that it's effective and it's useful. If I continue to deliver 12,000 page PDFs to my admins, nothing will ever get done. If I can give them a one-page list of the top 10 things that would save our organization, I promise you it will get done that day. I've seen this similar kinds of things here. We've done work with DevOps team or dev teams and DevOps teams. Sorry, I'm gonna roll my eyes a little bit. DevOps buzzwords. I know. But you know, one company I did some work with, we integrated their web application scanning results into kind of a middleware thing that translated the findings from the security tool, like SQL injection, and changed it into, I hate to say code speak, but it transformed through their code playbooks into the blocks of code of how to create or how to correct those kinds of problems. So the middleware would essentially translate, if we see SQL injection of this nature, the standardized code method we use is this, put that information into a Jira ticket. That company went from a situation where they were taking anywhere from about 180 to 200 days to remediate web application vulnerabilities because they had just been sending the SQL injection findings and the devs didn't know what to do with it. When we switched this around, we had remediation times under 36 hours. So you have to talk, get this information in a way that makes sense to people. Know who those audiences are. Report in a way that makes sense to them. Don't report in a way that makes sense to you. I mean, you'll also have reports for yourself, but outside audiences, help them do this stuff. This is a true vulnerability management program. When you structure it based on risk, as you'll see here in a couple of slides, it changes a little bit how you do this. And arguably, it actually makes this a little bit easier. Any questions so far? Okay. Everyone wants to get to lunch, I know, okay. So let's talk about what this means. So old school, we kind of lived over here, right? Again, run scans, get a total number of vulnerabilities. We've got 450,000 vulnerabilities in the environment, and I'm going to tell management that's what we've got. We're going to get a right to work and patch everything and move on. Now, for any of you who've been doing this, if you've ever actually been the admin who's gone that route, tell me if this sounds familiar. You run your scan day 1 of the month, Microsoft Patch Tuesday comes out, your vulnerability totals shoot through the roof, your teams patch really well, but a lot of things come out that aren't patchable, and the number comes back down to the same place it was when you started. Good, lots of nodding, I love that. Having to sit in a boardroom and explain to a CEO why month after month the vulnerability total never goes down, even though they're spending a lot of money on a security team that's supposedly doing a lot of work, it doesn't go well. It's a really hard thing to explain. But we're still doing it. I mean, probably some of you in this room have organizations that are doing this exact metric right here still, okay? This is where we have to stop. This is the kind of thing we change when we look at this from a risk-based approach. If you look at it from a risk-based approach, the underlying idea is identify the things that are most risky to your organization. That needs to factor in the criticality of the asset. How important is that asset to you? How important is that asset to other assets? Understanding what the vulnerability actually means, how critical that vulnerability actually is, and then using all of that together to be able to say, well, if I have this vulnerability on my perimeter system, that's a much bigger problem than having that vulnerability on a system that's a laptop that's never on our network and it's just sitting in storage. You start to prioritize where you make your remediation efforts, and when you structure it that way, your metrics change, the way you report changes, the way you look at your environment changes, and this is where, at least for us at Tenable, and certainly my colleagues in the industry, we've seen the movement to that, right? Stop trying to boil the ocean. Stop trying to just remediate everything. We've been trying that for 20 years. We're still not remediating everything. So we want to focus on what matters. Now, I'm up here talking about Tenable. Tenable, if you know us or if you hear more speeches from us, our marketing folks are really good at pushing this message right now. It's a big deal. As a practitioner, I'm going to tell you that we're not the only ones. Gartner recently identified risk-based vulnerability management as essentially a new thing they want to start tracking. They had given up a little bit on some of their magic quadrant kind of things for vulnerability management because it was being seen as a commodity service, and there were three main vendors who all did scanning, and we don't really have to keep revisiting the same thing, and they were right. But they're starting to see that this risk-based approach is important. It changes. It's different than the old way. And even from their analysis, they're seeing the frameworks of how that works. They see that this is actually a path to remediation, a path to actually fixing things, which that's the whole point of doing vulnerability management, right? Know where the problem is so we can fix it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the problems with that. So historically, when we try to take a risk-based approach, or we have in the past, just about everybody I know has relied very heavily on CBSS to identify the severity of a vulnerability. Everybody here familiar with CBSS? Generally? Okay, perfect, thank you. It sucks. It sucked forever. It really does. they've had to do version updates on it, and there's been the, there was that point in time where we had to add the base score and the environmental score, and we have to give it context, and then nobody actually knows what any of it means. What's an 8 versus an 8.2? I don't know. I'm patching 9s. I don't care about that. So CBSS is a real problem, and to their credit, Carnegie Mellon talked a little bit about this, and even they've admitted, like, this isn't really a risk tool. This was just a way to get kind of a technical vulnerability structure around these things to kind of understand how severe it was potentially. But this isn't about risk. This is just about, oh, this is full remote access, and so that's pretty severe. Okay, we'll just give it a higher number. And now at least everyone can ballpark something. This has to go. This is one of the things that's going. Now, my caveat to that, a lot of regulations still require CBSS to be the benchmark for this, so you're still going to be working with it. But you can do it in parallel with other methods and other systems, if you will. So don't give up on it completely, because you can't. But I wouldn't continue to use CBSS as your way of understanding what the risk means to you, because it just won't. All right. We can see this kind of thing in statistics like this. Now this came out of my Tenable research group, which, if you're not familiar, is a part of Tenable, but it's a group of about 100 people we've got now dedicated to doing security research of one way, shape, or form. They are our folks who drive our detection plugins, the way to our scanners actually find these things. They also do a lot of R&D testing on devices. We find and report 0 days into NIST and other agencies all the time. In fact, I think last year we had 135 0 days that our group found and identified. So they're a pretty serious group. They've been doing this for a long time, and luckily now our data science group also helps them look at things like this. We looked at this a couple years ago. I still use this information because I find it pretty easy to tell. If you looked at the vulnerabilities that were released year over year, the blue thing down here is really the important line. That's the number of vulnerabilities that were identified by NIST through CVE, CBSS scores were assigned, all this good stuff. But that blue number is really the ones that actually had exploits in the wild. So again, if we're trying to fix everything, are we wasting our time with the wrong stuff? If I'm up here fixing everything, I'm maybe leaving myself exposed to the stuff that's actually being attacked today. In the old model, there's no way to figure that out. You take a risk-based approach. These is almost criteria point number 1 for risk, right? If there's an exploit, that's a higher problem right now. So let me talk a little bit about the Tenable model for how we look at this. Again, you're welcome to talk to us about it. If you want to adopt some of this for your own models, I have seen some very, very complicated schemes in my career that people have built internally on their own. You're welcome to it. Just don't make it too complicated. Do yourself a favor. Anywhere you can make it easier. But let me talk a little bit about how we approach this, give you an idea about why this is different than just the traditional scan, give it a CBSS number, and move on. So we start with 2 basic concepts, something called a vulnerability priority rating, and then the asset criticality rating. Simply put, we create a VPR score that starts with CBSS and then heavily, heavily modifies it based on a data science model we use for the threat intelligence we see in the world. And I'll talk about this in 2 slides about what that model looks like and how it's built. But our research team basically drives this whole thing. If they start to see activity out there in the wide internet or the dark web, sorry, I'm not a buzzword guy, I apologize. But if we're seeing the status of these vulnerabilities change, if there was not an exploit kit before, but now there is, if we're seeing ransomware attached to that exploit kit now, we didn't see that before, those start to become more of a problem. And so we'll actually dynamically raise that score, because that vulnerability now has higher priority. It's more of a problem. The other side of it that we have to factor in is the asset criticality rating. Like I described, some of your assets are more important than others, right? Now, some of this, we actually can automate some piece of this to some extent, at least to give you a baseline, because a device that has a web server on it or a database is likely far more important to your organization than a standard workstation. So we can do a little bit of figuring out, is this thing more important than another thing? But we really you have to rely on your business to decide that. This is a business context scoring system. You have to know your business well enough. Excuse me. You have to be able to identify that this group of servers runs our critical infrastructure. This is the important thing. Raise that criticality rating, because if those go down, it's the end of our business, right? You take the vulnerability priority, as it changes, you add that, factor it in with the asset criticality, you output something that our marketing people refer to as our cyber exposure score. And it is essentially a new number, but it's a single number to say, this is how risky things are for you right now. Once you have this kind of thing in place, though, it becomes a lot easier to prioritize your remediation effort, because now I know where I'm most at risk, and I know which assets are most critical, and I need to start there. Because if those get hit, it's the most impact, right? Where that pulls together is factoring a lot of things. So as I mentioned, there's the base rating, the research insights from our team, and then we also pull a lot of threat intelligence. We've got, where is it? Here it is. About 150 different data points, different pieces of metadata about a vulnerability that we pull together. I can't go into tons of detail about that because my counsel will have problems with me giving up intellectual property. But just know that we look at a lot of different factors like this. We look at what's happening in the industry. We look at what's happening live. What's the trend been in the past for these types of vulnerabilities? Has it been exploited before? What kind of access does it provide? Is the exploit up for sale in marketplaces? That kind of thing. There's just a ton of different factors that we wrap into this whole thing to output that vulnerability score. You want to be able to do this. If you're going to do this on your own, you want to look at doing something similar. Pull information about the vulnerability from a lot of different contexts. If you're just looking at CBSS, you may not have a real understanding of what that vulnerability actually is doing. When you're pulling in data like this, though, your model starts to change. Let me show you I'll give you a couple of examples of what we've seen. So this was a 2018 release of Soudan Ransomware. It was a Windows vulnerability. And CBSS, the bottom lines here, you may not be able to see in the back, but the two bottom lines down here, CBSS was released. The version 2 score came in at 7.2. The version 3, the updated model for CBSS, came in at 7.8. And once those numbers are assigned, it's done. That's it. They've decided that's the technical vulnerability. They're done. Our team we tracked this thing for quite a while. And this line in the middle is actually our VPR score, our priority rating, as it changed over time due to what we saw happening in the real world. And as events transpired, the scoring that we put out there changed as well. For my purposes, I've helped companies in my past try to do this on their own. It's actually kind of fun now for me to see a company doing it sort of automatically, kind of. Our research team drives a lot of it. But, where was it? Oh, yeah. We saw the up and down usage of the exploit, right? There was talk about it on the dark web. There was people, hacker communities were really excited about this. There were some people actively testing it at one point, and then it kind of faded off a little bit. They poked at it. People were patching. It wasn't such a big deal until Soudan itself came out. When the ransomware package was built and actively tried to take care of this activate this exploit, the scoring comes back up again because now there's a new threat that's leveraging this vulnerability. Okay? So if you're used to the old model of how you figure this stuff out from a vulnerability management perspective, you got your CBSS score. That complies or helps you with the PCI line, right? Everything 7 or above has to be taken care of, and we stop thinking about it. It's not real. This isn't actually risk. This is your risk. Okay? So you change the model. You change how you view these vulnerabilities. It becomes a dynamic process. You have to be more on top of these things. You have to be able to really be paying attention to what's going on, because depending on what's going on out there, you've got to react differently in your environment. Now, some of these things also go the other way. This is another CVE from 2018, one of the Oracle vulnerabilities. Same kind of concept here, right? CBSS came out and said, well, this is database, it's Oracle, it's a really serious problem, so we're giving this thing I think it was a 9.1. It's really bad. But then we didn't really see a lot of activity on it. There was a proof of concept at one point. There was some discussion about it. There was a little bit of testing it and seeing if they could use it for anything worthwhile. And then they kind of just moved on. The hacking community, the malicious actors, just kind of moved on. There wasn't really a whole lot that they were going to do with it. There wasn't a ransomware piece they were going to leverage. I mean, Oracle databases are common targets, but no one's logging into them to accept the ransom. So, for our purposes, this was not as big of a risk. That doesn't mean you don't fix it, okay? But against other problems, this is a much lower risk, right? So CBSS can work for or against you depending on how you're approaching it. Taking that risk-based model changes how you look at all of this. Let me show you one more thing. The other nice thing about looking at this from a risk approach is much like any risk manager, you talk about insurance companies, we talk about likelihood, right? And when you start living in the world of likelihood, does this look like something might happen? We can start to get into some predictiveness, okay? So this was another vulnerability that came out, also 2018, vulnerability in Linux. And we actually started posting a risk score on this thing almost 3 months before CBSS did. And a lot of that was because we were seeing activity. When that thing came out, we saw what it did. Our researchers found what the exploit could do, started seeing the conversations around the tests that were happening out there by malicious actors. We got a risk score on this and said, we're still gathering data, but this is likely a problem. If we see this level of activity and this much conversation and proof of concepts being developed, something's likely going to happen here. We've seen this before. Now, it tapered off. Didn't actually end up getting too bad. But you notice that the activity picks up back again when the CBSS score comes out. And part of that is because just the way that malicious actors work. Once the CBSS is announced, especially if it's a high enough one, they know PCI companies are going to jump on it, so their window is going to get short if they're actually going to use it. And so they're going to make another run at it, essentially. But you see, again, this is, if you're relying on CBSS, if you've built your model on the kind of the old way of doing it, you had no visibility on that thing until here. No way to quantify how bad of a problem that is, right? So this risk modeling kind of approach, this is where we're going. This is the future, if you will, of vulnerability management, is to try to understand the real tangible risk and as it applies to you, not necessarily to your neighbor, and then give you a better way to try to address those things in an appropriate manner. Make sense? Everybody's good? Easy? Please.
Doing a deep dive on that, if you don't know patch from the vendor, no way to remediate it because it's a critical business system. How do you then report that? How do you make that relevant to the team?
So just in case you couldn't hear, so the question basically is if there's no patch release or any way to really remediate it, how do you report that up to the teams that need to know about it? I'll tell you my experience with this. It's painful, right? Operations teams, you talk to the data center managers and the folks who actually have to do the patching, they just want a list of work to do. Like, give me the list of patches, I'll go apply them, leave me alone. I got too much to do. I don't need to have a conversation about maybes. Okay, it's fair, they got a lot of work to do, but we have to have that conversation. So for me, what I've typically recommended in the past is the security teams need to have a better relationship with the business teams, business unit groups, business leadership, because they, at the end of the day, are going to be able to tell you better what is risky to the environment and what has a greater impact than the server administrators or the developers who are just like, I'm just writing the code. I don't care what you guys do with it. They might have that insight. I'm not trying to disparage. Apologize. I really am not. But this is not their function, right? They're not there to do business analysis. They're there to get work done. So what I've done in the past essentially is recommended that when you see an initial risk, when you're at the way early stage of this thing, And the security team has said, we actually believe this is a problem. We want to do something about it now. You go to the business teams to see if they have agreement. And you just post that problem. We can't really remediate. We're working with the vendor. We've got to wait on them. Or we have another plan. Maybe you come up with a different way. Do you agree that this is a business impact and we need to spend time and energy to focus on this? If the business says yes, then it's much easier to go back to the technical folks and say, listen, it's just got to get done. So what do? You're the experts. Do we firewall it off? Do we unplug it? Do we sink it into a block of concrete and dump it into the harbor? I mean, whatever. You have to start talking about what makes sense for the organization to how you remediate that. And it's going to, again, it's different for everyone. You know, what you find acceptable, you might not, right? It's just, you have to know what the context is for yourself. But start with the business leaders. If you can do that, you start to put yourself on the side of the technical folks, because then you can just say, hey, listen, I'm in this with you, man. I just got told I got to do it just like, you know, I'm telling you. So we're a team. Let's just sort it out. And honestly, it works. I have sat down with a lot of engineers in my career, and then when they feel like you're hearing them and you are on their side and not just telling them to do more work, they'll bend over backwards to get done. Make sense? Good? Okay. Please. So that's a really good question. So who should come up with the plan? Right. Yeah. I'm going to tell you the thing that I feel like I am most famous for in my consulting career in security. It depends. So here's the problem. When you don't have an obvious solution like a patch, then you have to ask a very hard question about what are we likely going to be able to do about this, if anything. Sometimes that solution is technical. And then yes, you need to go to the technical people and say, listen, you're responsible for the server. You tell me, would this plan, can we do this? Can we turn off the service? Can we update to a new version of the database? Can we, whatever the technical things. And you need to let the admins essentially say, I'll tell you the best way to do this because I live in the device. It's mine, right? If you're not going to go with the technical control, then yeah, you've got to go to the security leadership or the business leadership to say, we can't fix it yet. Do you want to buy insurance? Do you want to just accept the risk? Do you guys want to tell our customers something? Do you want to institute a new workflow so that we don't touch this data in the same way? You know, those kind of business process questions, if that's how you're going to mitigate it, have to go to them. So again, as security practitioners, think of yourself as a risk manager, not an IT person. We have to be able to talk to all of those teams, all right? So security should at least be able to identify the basic, like we think it should go this way, and then go work through that team. But there's never going to be one right answer, and you may have to circle back. You know, the technical folks may come back and say, it can't be done. We thought we could fix it, we can't. Now we have to find a business solution. So it's hard. It's a hard problem. That's why a lot of us have jobs, because it's a hard problem, right? Okay, we have a few minutes left. I want to run down very quickly some of the questions. Now, these are really more questions that if you're taking this risk-based approach, again, you change the view of how you're solving these vulnerabilities in your environment. There's an aspect of this, really, we're admitting we're not going to do them all. And there are people who are in leadership positions who don't like that. They like absolutes, right? They like it when their staff comes in and says, it's done, right? It's vulnerabilities, it's never done. It's never done, okay? So we are accepting to some extent that we're not going to get to zero when it comes to vulnerabilities. But we're changing that conversation about prioritization. We're changing the conversation about impact to the business. And so again, the questions that we're starting to answer when you go down this road fundamentally change than what the questions we asked before. All right, so I'm going to go through these fairly quick, but if you have questions, hopefully we'll have a time, but we can also talk after this. So getting away from just the scan, report, and go method, let's get into actual risk management. When we talk about remediation, you're asking these kinds of questions. You know, which vulnerabilities are actually the biggest problem? Who has the authority to pull the trigger on the patch? Who are the right people to make sure that, yes, this is the right prioritization and it should be done? Do we know how we're going to do it? To answer your point, There might not be a patch. There's got to be different ways. We have to answer that question. And this last part about it, like if you can't fix it, what are you going to do about making sure you note that? This is something I can say that there are groups within Tenable right now as a software tool that does this work. We're trying to build out feature sets right now to allow the recording of this kind of information. The subjective, business context, we did not remediate this because XYZ. Has nothing to do with scanning, has nothing to do with our detection methods. It has everything to do with helping the customer figure out how to answer this, how to put context around what did we do and why didn't we do it, right? Again, it changes the questions. When you get into reporting, we stop talking about the whole total number of vulnerabilities that we're dealing with. We really start asking questions like, how are we doing? Are we making progress? Are there areas of our environment that aren't doing so well? I have seen platforms here that have been built in the past. State Department did one in 2007, United States State Department. They built a thing for their embassies. They gamified it for 147 embassies worldwide. And gave them a letter grade for their security program. Said, you are embassy number 93 out of 147, and you have a C+. And just that alone, just that gamification of being able to notify the individual business groups that you're not doing as great as your cohorts, they had in 1 year like a 60% reduction in their vulnerability posture worldwide, just because they put people on notice essentially that you're not doing as well as your peers. Identifying where you have those kinds of groups in your environment, really, really critical, right? Don't always make it a wall of shame. But a wall of shame works sometimes, so, be smart about it, do it the right way. You asked about questions about where you're exposed. And this goes beyond just, I have a server that's not patched. This is, do my applications expose me? Do I have data floating out there that I don't know about? Do I have web servers out in the public internet hosting domains that I don't know about? Well, where am I potentially being attacked? When you just do the scan and report, you don't really care. You just scan the whole IP range and you move on. When you're looking at risk, you care about where those spots are. Okay. Please.
Nathan, thank you. Earlier you mentioned that time to remediation time, how our organization reduce the time to remediate from weeks to days, hours.
Can.
What other KPIs do you see to measure the performance of risk-based vulnerability management?
So I'll repeat for everybody. So the question the short version is, what are some metrics you use to report on the success of a risk-based effort? Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, time to remediate is big. When you have this kind of scoring system on priorities, our VPR, our cyber exposure score at Tenable speak, seeing that number come down, right? Because if that number comes down, what we're saying is the number of risky, high-risk problems is decreasing in your environment. The number of assets that are critical and are exposed is lowering. You are actually remediating severe problems. That CBSS doesn't do a good job of that, and even broad numbers, right? We fixed 100,000 vulnerabilities. Doesn't really tell you that, because I could have been patching, CBSS 3 vulnerabilities. That doesn't really reduce risk very much. So having whatever scoring methodology you're going to use for your data model, for the risk identifier, seeing that come down is a big one. I also, age of vulnerabilities, how long do vulnerabilities remain unpatched in your environment is a very valuable one. Because the longer you give attackers an opportunity, the higher the chances it's going to be attacked. So those three are key places for me to start. And then a lot of it comes down to what the business wants. Sure. Okay, we've got 60 seconds. I'm going to blow through this. Hunters, if you're pen testing, if you are a security person, you want to find what's going on. When you start to take this risk-based approach, again, we're getting past just what's not patched. We're getting into things like, why do I have Telnet open on 400 devices? Why is there a web service running somewhere that shouldn't have a web service? There's all kinds of things that once that exposure concept starts to come out, you stop worrying about patches, you start worrying about the scary stuff, because these are the things that attackers are going to find and use. All right, so there's a lot of places where you can reduce risk in the environment that aren't about patches. but are still very, very important when you're dealing with proper vulnerability management. Certificates, by the way, is one of my favorite conversations to talk about because that's a great avenue to own a domain or start man-in-the-middle attacks for things. It's not patchable, but you better be looking at that as part of your vulnerability management program. Integration points. This is another thing we see a lot of changes about. When we're looking at our security posture based in risk, risk applies to other things. We're out of the IT world now. We're now talking about business risk. So you can integrate this into all kinds of places, your CMDB, your data management systems, your development groups. I've seen people do this in their ERP systems so that HR and finance have visibility on the safety levels, essentially, of the assets they're most concerned about, right? All kinds of ways that you can start to change the conversation inside your business from an integration standpoint, way outside the scope of just patching. Finally, I'll let you guys read this very quickly, but I think the most important for me, honestly, is the remediation effort one. Getting that 12,000-page PDF down so that it's actionable, it's meaningful, the teams get it done. That's one of probably your biggest benefits. From an ROI standpoint, you want to quantify why you want to do it this way. That's going to be your big win. But there's still a lot more you can do. If you as a security team can start reporting operational risk in a different way to management, you're a hero. They've been dying for that information. You're trying to get yourself out of the scan management business. At the end of the day, that's really what you want to do. The scans you just run, automate that, gather the data, but you're in the risk analysis business. Find where it's scariest, find out the best way to focus the limited resources you have to fix it, and then go fix it. Or send the report to someone else to fix it, because I don't have time for that. Does that make sense? I mean, it seems simple, but I'm telling you, for 20 years, we've still been fighting, trying to get this very approach done. And I think in the industry, we're finally seeing it. Please.
So, credential-based scanning and agent-based, in your experience, which is better and why in a complex environment?
So the question is, in scanning environment, or scanning, network-based scanning versus agents, which one's better? In a complex environment. What's my phrase here? It depends. Sorry. No, it really does. So look, I've worked in organizations that have 1.5 million assets, and they will not run scans. Their network is too complicated. They have too much segregation. They just won't do it. So agents are their only way. That's how they're going to do it. I've also worked with organizations that are significant tech companies in the Seattle area, known for making operating systems. They will only scan. And they have a scanning architecture that would blow your mind. They have devices to scan everywhere, and they run them constantly. They don't do agents for anything. They don't want the extra software on their assets. They want to be able to see what it looks like from an intruder's perspective, and they only want to do network-based scanning. So the answer is there's no one answer. Every organization kind of has to figure out tactically what's the best approach to do that. You've got a lot of air-gapped environments. Agents may be a good choice. You've got a flat network. Scanning is going to work pretty well. You want to use a combination of both, probably a good plan. But you really have to figure that out for yourself to see what makes the most sense for your particular architecture.
And is there a way we can minimize the resource that agent takes if we go by?
I can only speak for Tenable officially, and the answer is yes.
Yes.
How do you see vulnerability management changing as the world moves towards cloud computing and serverless?
So again, the question, how do we see it changing, vulnerability management changing for cloud environments and serverless environments? To Brian Krebs' point this morning, cloud computing is just someone else's server, it's just someone else's network. It's not going to change. Now we're going to have to change our tactics of how we go about assessing that kind of thing. I get asked about container security on about a daily basis. And conceptually, there's no real difference. We just have to talk to the underlying container support thing, Kubernetes or whatever we're using at a given time. We have to learn how to talk to that differently to get the information so we can make good choices about it. But conceptually, it doesn't change. And that's, for me, and I've talked to a lot of my colleagues about this movement to risk-based approach. when we stop talking about technical scanning for vulnerabilities, we can now have better conversations about how we solve that problem. Because now, maybe I don't actually want to scan my containers infrastructure. I just want to get a data dump out of the management tool and integrate that into the rest of my vulnerability management tools and then do my analysis and everything there. So the answer really is, we're fundamentally from a detect, prioritize, remediate standpoint, nothing's going to change with that workflow. That is really the basis of what we're trying to do. How we gather that data, though, changes. And this approach lets you do that. I've been working with some customers lately on the OT side of life, which are some really crazy manufacturing and power systems that run power grids and that kind of thing. We actually just recently acquired a product that allows us to talk to those devices natively. It's not a scan. We don't attack it. We're not doing any kind of pen testing. They just can't come down. But we can now pull all that information in a very safe manner to say, well, you haven't talked to Honeywell in 3.5 years because your versions are here and you're configured this way, and now you have risk. Right? So we're going to find new methods of gaining that data, but fundamental process of VM, I don't think it's ever going to change. Any other questions? We're a little over time, but I'm happy to keep chatting. Please.
In an earlier slide, you mentioned authenticated scanning versus non-authenticated.
I did. Okay. So a question about authenticated scanning versus non-authenticated scanning. So speaking as someone who, arguably, I've lived in the VM world my entire career. It's kind of my, outside of social engineering, which is really what I did my degree and a lot of my personal research on, vulnerability management's my technical thing. Authenticated scanning is the only way to go, period. You can do non-authenticated scanning if you just kind of want to see what a remote posture on your systems look like. If I just did a cursory scan, what does it kind of look like to an attacker? But from a data value perspective and a data accuracy perspective, running authenticated scans is the only way to operate, period. All right? I know it's hard for a lot of organizations. They get testy about, I'm not giving you a domain admin on all my, I understand the political challenges, and I've worked through them with a lot of companies. And if you have some questions about that, I'm happy to strategize with you about how to do that. But the value of the data is just so much more. You actually do detect more because it can log onto the system and ask it directly. For a Windows system, as example, I can query the registry. I can tell you exactly what patches are missing. I can tell you exactly how it's configured. We can do policy compliance testing on it once we do that. I can tell you how the thing is configured and if it's out of the way your gold image is set up. The value of the data when you run an authenticated scan puts it just literally an order of magnitude above a non-authenticated scan. So if you're building out these programs, make that part of step one. As hard as that is for management to sometimes agree with, but we're done, guys. We have to do it. We're the good guys. We're trying to find this data.
I find it's more of a challenge with technical, right,
Yep. Yeah, so the technical folks, man. I thought, honestly, when I started my career in 93, just out of high school, I guess, 93, all these old school mainframe programmers were telling me how they've been doing this for 40 years and I'm not letting anyone ever touch my systems. And at the time, I just thought that's just an old mainframe mindset and that's going to change. I was wrong. Because every Linux admin, Unix admin, Windows admin, networks, all of them, they all have this ownership kind of mentality. I mean, we could talk offline a little bit. I have some tricks that I've used in my career to try to get through those guys. And I've been pretty successful with it. But they are a hard one. There's no question about that. Appeal to them as an equal is the best way to go about that. When they feel you understand why they're resisting, they're more likely to say, okay, I just wanted to be heard, right? If you continue at it from management has said, and I need these credentials, there's no trust there. They're just going to shut you down. So there's a bit of an empathy approach that I often use, and sometimes I put a big bullseye on my forehead and I sit in a room and say, tell me all the reasons why you can't do it. And I've only heard basically 5 reasons in my entire career. It's always the same 5 reasons. It's always the same argument, and we answer that argument the same way every time. But generally speaking, with that kind of empathy approach, you can usually get those folks on board. All right, well over time, I'm very sorry, but thank you everybody for your time. If you have more questions, I will be around, so thank you very much. Please.